Hello, I'm Georgina Rose, and welcome back to the Dr. Darling YouTube channel. On this YouTube channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. So if you're interested in any of those subjects, definitely subscribe and check this channel out. And yeah, I'm Georgina Rose. I'm a perennialist, a polytheist, I'm a thelemite, and in this video we're going to talk about Thelema. So I've made a ton of videos on Thelema, and if you're not familiar with Thelema, you might want to watch some of those first, but I'll still give a short rundown of what Thelema is. So Thelema is a religion, philosophy, and magical system brought into the world by Aleister Crowley. He received Thelema through a channeled work known as the Book of the Law and several other channelings he would have later on that he received in Cairo. And Thelema basically takes a lot of Western esotericism, yoga, some Eastern mysticism, paganism, and kind of brings it all together and centers it around a core philosophy based around the idea of true will and the idea that every individual has their own true will, which is kind of like a purpose given to you by the Godhead that you must discover, and then by following your true will, you may one day accomplish the great work, which is reunification with the Godhead. Thelema is a wildly syncretic tradition, and it is one of the most influential occult paradigms to date. And in this video, we're going to be talking about the divine masculine within Thelema. I recently did discuss, I think about 2 months ago, the divine feminine within Thelema. So if you're interested in that side of the conversation, definitely check that video out after this one. It's also on this channel. But let's talk about the divine masculine. So the divine masculine and divine feminine are two really, really important metaphysical principles because they are a polarity. They are a metaphysical law. Essentially, the divine feminine is sort of restriction and limitation, and the divine masculine is creation. A good way to think about it, and a very Thelemic way to think about it, is to think of conception. When you are creating a new human being, you are creating life. What happens? The masculine releases the sperm, and then the feminine sort of selects the best sperm. It restricts, it, kills all the other sperm and chooses the best sperm, and then from that, with its selection intact, then forms a new life. This is basically how all the metaphysics of the divine masculine and divine feminine work. So the divine masculine is creation, the divine feminine is destruction. In Kabbalah, they're called mercy and severity. You can also think of these as the active, the masculine principle, and the receptive, the feminine principle. Now, it does start getting a little more complicated when you get to the really supernal spheres of things, the really sort of high on the chain of divinity concepts, but on most levels of metaphysics, this law pretty much applies. And so, what is the divine masculine? It is that generative, creative force. And there are many forms of the divine masculine that exist within Thelema. There is a common idea and saying that Thelemites will say that Thelema is a solar phallic religion. Essentially, Thelema is a sun cult. And being a Thelemite is all about connecting to the sun and finding your true will based on connection to the sun. And that is certainly mostly true. But there is a little bit more going on with the divine masculine in Thelema. I think it is reductive to limit the divine masculine within Thelema to just these solar archetypes. But since it is the most obvious and exoteric form of masculinity within Thelema, we are going to start there. So the first and most obvious masculine entity that we are going to see within Thelema is Hadit. So the Book of the Law is that channeled text that really outlines sort of what Thelema is. It is the thing that Crowley received that showed him what Thelema was and brought Thelema into this world. And there are 3 speakers or gods that sort of are channeled into the Book of the Law. Essentially what happened is he's, with his new wife, they're vibing in the pyramids, and she gets possessed, and over the course of 3 days, these 3 gods speak through her. And this first god is Hadit, the second is Nuit, and the third is Ra-Hoor-Khuit. We'll get to Ra-Hoor-Khuit later, but let's start with Hadit. So Hadit is this sun god. Hadit is a solar masculine entity. And Hadit also represents the self. So what does the sun represent within astrology? When we look at our natal chart, our birth chart, what is the sun? The sun is the ego. And I don't mean the ego as in this sort of negative modern idea we have about the ego as the ego is something bad. I mean ego in the literal psychological term. It is the base self. And thus, the sun god is going to be the god that the self identifies with when they go on their mystic quest. There are many Thelemic metaphysical writings where essentially it is written that Hadit is the self and Nuit is the endless expanse of space. So basically us, Hadit, are interfacing with Nuit space. As well, you will see this term sort of stars to refer to the individual in their mystic quest. These stars are brought to us by Hadit. So you often will see Hadit as the self-identified entity within Thelemic ritual. But even beyond that, Hadit is a sun god. Hadit is sort of the representation of this solar principle, this masculine solar principle. You're going to see, a lot of comparisons between Hadit and Ra, Hadit and Helios, Hadit and Apollo, Hadit and those sort of core solar male gods. Now, Hadit actually speaks second in the Book of the Law. So I do think I kind of miscommunicated what order the Book of the Law is in. There are 3 speakers, Hadit, Nuit, and Ra-Hoor-Khuit, but the order that they speak in is really important. So the first speaker is Nuit, and Nuit represents sort of the old pagan aeon, the old times, the original sort of ancient world. She very much represents that sort of goddess-oriented ancient pagan society. And then Hadit comes in second. Hadit represents sort of this second aeon of this kind of like divine masculine era, and yes, the Abrahamic religion. So there is an interesting sort of connection there. You know, when we look at Christianity in particular, Christianity is a solar religion, Christ is a solar archetype. Hadit does kind of sort of parallel some of those religions. And that's why you'll get this really weird take some people make where they're like, Thelema is just like Christianity, which is pretty obviously not true, but you can kind of get there when you look at Hadit. Hadit is this very solar masculine, and as well, you know, he's got those kind of virtuous qualities to him. He's got a lot of those qualities you think of when you think of a god. Now, this third speaker that we get to, the speaker of chapter 3, Ra-Hoor-Khuit, is the second obvious representation of the divine masculine within Thelema. So Ra-Hoor-Khuit is very different. Ra-Hoor-Khuit, his chapter, guns a-blazing. Ra-Hoor-Khuit is this very fiery, explosive, intense, and perhaps even choleric divine masculine, right? Ra-Hoor-Khuit, that chapter of the Book of the Law is always the one that freaks people out. It's basically all about war and fire, and Ra-Hoor-Khuit represents this new aeon, this aeon of Horus that sort of Thelema is bringing into the world, and sort of what's moving towards the eventual, that we are not at yet, the aeon of Ma'at, the aeon of peace and tranquility, that we'll get to one day. We're certainly not there, despite what some people will say. But yes, Ra-Hoor-Khuit is fire, fury. Ra-Hoor-Khuit, you know, you're going to really instantly want to connect that to this sort of male war god archetype. This darker, heavier, brutal, brash, intense sort of divine masculine archetype. And, you know, some people want to go pretty far with this and say that Ra-Hoor-Khuit is very martial, and it's certainly a bit of that there. But there still is a solar quality within Ra-Hoor-Khuit. After all, what is this aeon that the Ra-Hoor-Khuit represents? It is the aeon of Horus. Horus is still a sun god. So basically what happens with Hadit and Ra-Hoor-Khuit is we're actually looking at 2 sun gods, just 2 different sides of this solar coin. So with Hadit, that's your kind of classic light masculine sun god. And then with your Ra-Hoor-Khuit, you've got this martial solar quality coming in, and more of the dark divine masculine sort of coming into play, and those darker aspects of masculinity and the masculine mysteries, which some of the other figures will also kind of touch in to the dark divine masculine. We'll get to more of that in a little bit. Now, one other kind of solar figure that does appear in Thelema occasionally is Osiris. Within Thelema, Osiris represents the dying sun and the dying old aeon. It's really interesting because it's essentially kind of like a crone-like depiction of the divine masculine. Of course, in the divine feminine, we have the maiden mother crone cycle. This is kind of like a male crone cycle. Osiris is very much attached with a dying previous time within Thelema. And if you do some of those Golden Dawn rituals, it's obviously had a huge impact on Thelema. You do see this whole Osiris slain comment, right? And Osiris being represented as Osiris in death. Now, this is a really interesting depiction of death within a male god, because typically the sun is depicted sort of with Saturn and with this sort of power struggle between the sun and Saturn that's very common in a lot of religions. Within Thelema, you don't really see that because Saturn isn't actually identified with the divine masculine in Thelema. Thelema kind of takes this generative versus restrictive idea with masculinity and femininity pretty far. And so that kind of restrictive Saturnian quality where it's all about, those archetypes, that's actually part of the feminine within the entity Babylon. Babylon is the depiction of Saturn within Thelema. So there is no Saturnian masculine within Thelema. Osiris does, though, represent death and the connection between the masculine and death in Thelema. I think it's also worth exploring that kind of like tree of life understanding as well. So obviously I said, those restrictive pillar of severity themes are always coded as female and feminine within Thelema. So it does sort of make people wonder about Ra-Hoor-Khuit, because of course Ra-Hoor-Khuit is also martial. Solar is masculine, martial is feminine, though the sun is depicted on the sort of center pillar within Kabbalah. It is still kind of masculine principle aligned in many ways. You do see some interesting stuff with Ra-Hoor-Khuit because Mars is Gebo Ra, which is a feminine spear. So Ra-Hoor-Khuit, this is where it gets cool. Ra-Hoor-Khuit is depicted as the child. So what happens when the masculine and the feminine come together? They create the child. So Ra-Hoor-Khuit is masculine, but at the same time, Ra-Hoor-Khuit is this perfected child principle as well. So Ra-Hoor-Khuit is not 100% divine masculine. There is a little bit of that polarity merging within Ra-Hoor-Khuit. Now, another figure that comes up a lot within Thelema, especially as you get into more advanced parts of Thelema, is Pan. So Pan doesn't really come up in the Book of the Law, not a speaker in the Book of the Law, but does appear a lot in later Thelemic rituals and later Thelemic writings. Basically, as you progress, Pan becomes more and more of a thing. You first encounter Pan in some of these ceremonial rituals that you do, but you don't really encounter Pan until later on. So now I think it's worth talking about the evolution of the mystic within Thelema, because Pan kind of comes up towards the later half of that. So Thelema kind of gives you a track for progression, a sort of like progress order, essentially. So you get into Thelema, you learn some rituals, you learn some magic, you learn your correspondences, and then you go off to make knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel. Aleister Crowley got a lot of his information from his holy guardian angel, Aiwass. Aiwass, I would also say, is very solar. It's another solar quality within Thelema. But basically, you want to contact your own. So this holy guardian angel is going to give you a lot of really important information, and help guide you down the rest of your journey, because your true will, as I said, is given to you by divinity. It's not some sort of choice or want or desire. So only your holy guardian angel and ritual and communication with the Godhead can really tell you what your true will actually is. Otherwise, it's very hard to discern what's will versus want. A lot of people mistakenly think they're following their true will, and they're simply not, and they end up suffering. So this HGA stuff is really, really important, but that's not the end of it. You don't get your HGA and you're done. There's more that has to happen for you to unite with the Godhead. That's not the end. If anything, it's like the first benchmark. Now, after you get that HGA knowledge and conversation, you go through a number of other processes, and then eventually you get to the abyss. Crossing the abyss is a big thing within Thelema. Essentially, crossing the abyss is the dark night of the soul. It's that trial of the soul. It's that real test. And when you cross the abyss, you sort of seemingly lose knowledge and conversation with your holy guardian angel. You feel disconnected, you feel lost, and this is, on the tree of life. If you're thinking in those terms, this would be Dot. Now, you get to the other side, and to get to the other side, you basically have to annihilate yourself, perfect yourself, and show your metaphysical strength. So basically, you pass through this trial. There's this evil entity. I mean, really the purest form of evil within Thelema is this entity that's the dweller of the abyss known as Choronzon. Choronzon's basically just pure destruction, like destroy the cosmos, black hole energy. Choronzon's just a black hole. And basically you pass all that, and then you dissolve. And Pan is the gateway to dissolution. So metaphysically, Pan is really, really interesting, because when we think of Pan, we often think of Pan as a nature god, right? Pan is that horned god of nature, that European nature god that appears in Greco-Roman religion. And Pan is fascinating because Pan is both connected to Malkuth, that sort of earth level material plane, and sort of these really higher spears, specifically Chokmah, one of the highest spears on the Tree of Life. Pan is within both. Now, an interesting sort of view of this is that there's sort of two entities that relate to Pan. So some people will say that the lower form of Pan is Bacchus. Bacchus is that Roman god of ecstasy, madness, ferality, the wild, intoxication, and then Pan, that true god of the uncivilized and the untamed, is then like the supernal form of Bacchus and is this higher form. Pan and Bacchus have a lot of overlapping epithets, and if you read Aleister Crowley's Hymn to Pan, you do see Bacchus referenced once towards the beginning of that hymn and then not referenced subsequently throughout the hymn. So Crowley does appear to have essentially held this belief, but of course that is a bit up to interpretation. That's not said entirely explicitly by Crowley. Certainly it is an opinion I hold, though. But basically, yes, Bacchus is that kind of hedonistic, libertine sort of representation of Pan, and then Pan himself is literally pure dissolution. So what happens is when you approach Pan, you basically dissolve your entire ego, you dissolve your entire sense of self, you get annihilated, and then from that nothingness, after that point, once you're done with that, you then finally are able to unite with the Godhead, complete the great work, become an epistemiss, you're done, you did it. Now, how long that will take and if that can happen in this lifetime is a fun, debatable question you can discuss in the comments. But yes, Pan and Bacchus are a bit different. I think of those kind of materialistic Dionysian qualities as more Bacchus, and then those untamed, annihilatory, sublime, cerebral things as more Pan. But those entities certainly do get worked with together within Thelema. Now, I do want to sort of explore this Dionysian, Apollonian dichotomy that does appear to kind of show up in Thelema. So Crowley loved Nietzsche, and Nietzsche did talk about this Apollonian Dionysian dichotomy a lot, where basically like Apollonian is order, structure, control, and then Dionysian is like being loose and feral and free and hedonistic. Thelema definitely is a system that was mostly popular with and created by Libras. Thelema is all about balance. Thelema is all about perfection, about bringing polarities together, even if it may not seem like that from the outside. That is what the esoterics of it say. So definitely this mix of this Dionysian quality and that Apollonian quality of all that solar stuff is a big part of Thelema and about sort of bringing all those dichotomies together to create a higher form. Generally, look at the Book of the Law, those 3 chapters. You have the mother goddess, the father goddess, and you have the child. What is that about? Bringing 2 things together and creating a more perfected form. So you do see this Apollonian-Dionysian dichotomy quite present in Thelema, but Thelema does not ask you to pick a side. You don't have to be Apollonian or Dionysian. You actually want to be both. Now, some historic Thelemites have not been the best example of this. Let's be real, but it is the goal, okay? You want to be both. You want that temperance tarot card vibe, even if some people have not been the best examples. Not gonna name names. But yes, there is one other form of the divine masculine that does come up quite a bit in Thelema, and that is the form of Hermes, Mercury, Thoth. So Thelema is obviously influenced quite a bit by other and Western esoteric traditions, specifically ones that are from that kind of Hermetic, Gnostic sort of vibe. Aleister Crowley, before he started Thelema, was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as well he was a Freemason, so that kind of general lodge magic, Western esoteric sort of influence is very prominent within Thelema. The Golden Dawn in particular was, I would say, a very mercurial system. The Golden Dawn is very, very mercurial. And how would I explain mercurial things? So watch my finger. Go back and forth. I'm not doing EMDR for you. I'm showing you how Mercury works. Anything that goes back and forth quickly like this is mercurial. So that would be intellect, communication, wisdom, transportation, technology, travel. All of those themes are all mercurial themes. And certainly the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was kind of interested in these ideas. Mercurial mysticism is basically just alchemy. And let's look at this Thelemic formula, bringing opposites together, uniting the opposites and creating something better. Is that not the alchemical process? Is that not solve et coagula? Is that not the alchemical story? And so you do see occasionally, sort of as a bleed over for the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is very much interested in Hermeticism. And of course, Hermeticism was brought into the world by a legendary figure, debatably real or not, named Hermes Trismegistus, who was an avatar of Hermes, Mercury, and Thoth, which Hermes, Mercury, and Thoth, it's the same god. That's the same god, just in different sort of forms. Hermes, Mercury, Thoth, they are one entity, die mad. So basically, this sort of archetype of Hermes, Mercury, Thoth does come up here and there. And I will say, depending on kind of how you experience Thelema and the sort of stuff you prioritize, this may be more or less relevant. But I do think it's worth exploring kind of what mercurial masculinity is. So Mercury is not strictly masculine or feminine. It's considered a sort of neutral metaphysical energy. But there is still, I would say, a masculine archetype that comes to us from this kind of mercurial worldview. I think of sort of the archetype of the scholar, that occult academic, the guy in the alchemy lab, the guy studying, researching, learning. And I will say amongst Thelemites, that is like a personality type I definitely do see lifted up. So I do think that sort of archetype of the divine masculine is certainly present within Thelema. It's just not as emphasized as other things. And of course, now and again, other, male gods and deities do come up, especially within a ritual context. Thelemic rituals involve a lot of different deities. These are certainly what I would say the most prominent ones are, but I'm not going to say it's limited to this. As well, Thelemites aren't locked to just doing Thelema to be a Thelemite. You don't have to just repeat what Crowley did all day to be a Thelemite. So if you become a Thelemite, you can absolutely bring in other forms of the divine masculine. If you feel like there's too much light masculine or too much dark masculine, you can definitely bring in other traditions, other archetypes, other gods to sort of complete your system and make your system feel like something you're more connected to. I've met Thelemites personally who work with many other male gods. I've met Thelemites who do a whole gamut of other practices. So as long as you're sort of adhering to Thelemic principles, paying attention to the first principles, doing Thelema, you can absolutely syncretize it with other things and bring in other masculine forces. So it's kind of all I have to say about the dark divine masculine and the divine masculine as a whole within Thelema. I think the divine masculine is a really important concept within Thelema, just like the divine feminine. I really do recommend checking out the divine feminine video if you liked this. As well, please like, comment, and subscribe. That really, really helps. This channel is also supported through Patreon. So if you join the Patreon, you get a bonus video every month, over 20 pages of seasons and astrology-based rituals that I write custom every single month for my Patreon community. As well, you can get custom herbal preparations sent to your house, and mentorship meetings readings with me on the phone every single month where we talk about your practice, give you ritual ideas, and help you grow. As well, I'm a professional tarot reader and astrologer. My booking information will be below. I also host the podcast Pagan Perspectives by Georgina Rose. That's on this channel, but also on Spotify under Pagan Perspectives by Georgina Rose. So you can check this out here or there. I'm also on Substack, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, /X, and Threads. So I'm many places. You can find a lot more of my work in many of those places. As well, I have one of the biggest announcements of my entire tenure online coming up on the winter solstice. So please stay tuned to what I'm doing. There's something really big and really special coming up. So yeah. I'm just gonna say that because I'm, already, it's just right before Samhain when I'm recording this. This should come out right after Samhain. I'm already brimming with excitement, and I can't wait to tell you guys. So that's a little hint. But anyways, I'll talk to you guys next time. Have an amazing day, afternoon, mid-morning, mid-evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Like, comment, subscribe, and if you subscribe for 93 days, you will meet your holy guardian angel, and you'll not need to think about any of these concepts ever again. I've been Georgina Rose. Bye!